Excellencies, Your Excellency Mr. Amir Topi, President of the Republic of Albania, Your Excellency Mr. Donald Ramator, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, Your Excellency Mr. Ricardo Martinelli, President of the Republic of Panama, Your Excellency Mr. Nuposa Radmanovic, members of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Your Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, United Nations Secretary General, distinguished ministers and delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the high-level thematic debate on the state of the world economy. I am honored to co-chair this high-level meeting with the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Our joint effort in convening this conference is an example of cooperation for the sake of a strong United Nations. I commend Mr. Ban for his leadership and guidance on the global economy and sustainable development. I would start by extending my gratitude to the high-level representatives and eminent panelists who are joining us today. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to the member states and to the co-facilitator of this event, His Excellency Mr. Erdogan Abakan, Permanent Representative of Turkey to the United Nations, and His Excellency Mr. Daniele Budini, Permanent Representative of San Marino to the United Nations. Both ambassadors and their respective missions offered invaluable assistance through their support in helping to prepare for today's event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the global economy is at a critical juncture. Nearly every day, we are actually aware that there are pressing economic and financial issues that need to be tackled if we are to embark on a robust, sustained, and inclusive global recovery. A recovery that will escalate development, improve employment, and lift another billion people out of poverty. It is well known that on the aftermath of the crisis, there has been significant adverse impact on both developed and developing countries. Developing countries in particular have been affected by circumstances that were not on the first instance of their own making. Moreover, within all countries, it has been the vulnerable sections of society, the poor, who have been hardest hit by the downturn on incomes and employment. Today, in the great spirit of democracy, populations are making their concern about the global economy heard. They are demanding more economic safety, more jobs, more opportunities, more justice, and more respect for the environment. In responding to such demands and working to improve the economic and employment conditions on their respective countries, member states have varied on their approaches. In a diverse world, this is only natural. However, our overarching priority must be shared one. Our overarching priority must be to implement an effective, globally coordinated policy that serves to place the world economy on the path of sustained growth and development. Today's conference provides a timely opportunity to address these issues on an inclusive, candid, and responsible manner. This high-level thematic debate reaffirms the central role of the United Nations through its General Assembly and the international deliberations on the world economy and sustainable development. In doing so, we must strive to convey a strong and unified message to all stakeholders. We must first identify and then propose specific measures to address the ongoing economic and financial challenges and their impact on development. These issues are incorporated into the 4 roundtables of this thematic debate. Roundtable 1 will focus on the theme of combating unemployment, creating jobs, especially for women and youth, addressing poverty and social protection. The overall level of unemployment and youth unemployment in particular remain unacceptable high world. As I heard last month from many heads of state and government and ministers during the 13th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, held in Doha, addressing unemployment is today an extremely urgent task for developing, no less than developed countries. Measures to generate productive employment should urgently be put in place and moreover should be accompanied by policies to promote social protection for workers, including social safety nets. Efforts in this area should be seen as integral component of a broader long-term strategy geared towards poverty reduction, which would also include policies in areas such as education, health, and access to finance. It should be emphasized that in order to achieve these objectives, developing countries would require considerable support from the international community. The theme of Roundtable 2 is debt sustainability, managing inflation and deflation. Debt sustainability remains as a concern in a number of developing countries that could be adversely affected by spillover effects from the regional debt crisis and other risk factors, such as continuing high volatility on food, energy, and other commodity prices. It is important that effectiveness of debt sustainability framework be re-examined. More work needs to be done in a number of related areas, including this instrument and institutional mechanism to better deal with debt disaster. Debt sustainability is influenced by macroeconomic fundamentals at the national level and by external shocks on the international financial and monetary system. An important challenge facing policymakers is the need to understand macroeconomic stability in a broad sense that includes not only price stability and sustainable fiscal policies, smoother economic cycle, sustainable levels of external debt, and healthy domestic financial system, but also an efficient rules-based international system that enhance stability, foster efficient and equitable international allocation of investment resources, and provides effective mechanism for assuring effective policy coordination. Roundtable 3 is entitled Creating an Environment for Increasing Production, Trade and Investment, including through transparency and predictability of commodity prices. The effective promotion of production, investment, and trade requires a wide range of efforts at all levels. While developing countries should undertake efforts to create a domestic environment favorable to increasing productivity, competitiveness, and innovation, they would in many instances require technical and financial assistance from the international community. It is also important to recognize that international conditions can have a profound impact on investment and production and trade. Many commodity-dependent developing countries continue to be highly vulnerable to excessive volatility of commodity prices. Moreover, volatile food and energy prices undermine efforts to eliminate extreme poverty and hunger by reducing household income and increasing pressure on national budgets in many developing countries. Just a few weeks ago, in response to GA Resolution 66/188, and in partnership with His Excellency Leonel Fernandez, President of the Dominican Republic, I convened a high-level thematic debate on addressing excessive price volatility on food and related commodity and financial markets. Together with political leaders, regulators, general bankers, private market participants, and a variety of experts from universities and the UN system, we examined the advance linking the explosive growth of financial investment and commodities futures markets, the commodity price volatility, and by extension, their impact on development. We hope to continue this conversation today and other venues in the near future. It is also of critical importance to have an enabling environment for international trade, and in this regard, a successful conclusion of the Doha round with balanced, ambitious, comprehensive, and development-oriented outcome is essential. Finally, Roundtable 4 will deal with increasing stability, predictability, and transparency on the global financial system. The world financial and economic crisis and its aftermath have exposed significant limitations on the international monetary and financial system. A number of important areas need to be addressed in the process of strengthening international financial stability and improving the efficiency of the international financial system and channeling saving to productive investment. Important and finished tasks include enhancing multilateral oversight, improving oversight of the world's important financial institutions, strengthening the transparency of risk rating mechanism, and improving regional financial cooperation. It is also important to broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in international economic decision-making and norm setting. Over the past 20 years, there has been significant progress on the development of rules-based international trading system, but very little movement towards a rules-based international monetary and financial system. In light of this imbalance on the institutional structure of global governance, the United Nations may have an important role to play. The United Nations remain the only truly universal and inclusive multilateral forum, and is well placed to enable member states to participate in various reform processes aimed at improving and strengthening the effective functioning of the international financial system and architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, our deliberations in this high-level thematic debate will also provide an important input into various related UN processes, including next month's UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio, Brazil, the Financing for Development follow-up processes, the discussions on global economic governance, and the future of the Millennium Development Goals. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the UN General Assembly cannot but answer the call of citizens worldwide, the call for security and for dignity. Today, we are taking a step towards answering their call. I wish you productive deliberations, and I thank you. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations and co-chair of the high-level thematic debate, His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, distinguished heads of state and government, excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, I would like to highly commend your leadership and vision to convene this very important high-level thematic debate on the state of world economy and its impact on its development. I also thanked the co-facilitators, the ambassadors of Turkey, Mr. Apakan, and Ambassador Bodini of San Marino for their contributions. Excellencies, we meet during testing times. Every day, we read about the ongoing crisis in the Eurozone. Elsewhere, people speak of recovery, but it is largely a jobless recovery. Since the financial and economic crisis began, 200 million people have lost jobs and income. In too many places, poverty and inequality are on the rise. Hard-won development gains are under threat. Most of our discussions over the next day and a half will focus on these very immediate issues and how to deal with them. But today, I want to talk about the big picture. Let us face the facts. The old model is broken. We need to create a new one, a new model for dynamic growth. A growth that is equitable, growth that can be sustained within planetary boundaries, growth that will benefit current and future generations. This is the focus of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development next month in Rio de Janeiro. Rio +20 is our opportunity to establish a new paradigm for growth, building on works, discarding what does not. We need nothing less than a revolution in our thinking about the foundations of dynamic growth and the well-being of future generations. A new paradigm based on stable economies and decent jobs and opportunities for all. 20 years ago, the Earth Summit laid out a roadmap for sustainable development. We have not followed the map. Since then, our world has changed. Threats that were foreseen 2 decades ago are today's reality. A clear and present danger, a more fragile environment, a rapidly warming world, growing scarcities of natural resources, more and more people in need of food, energy, water, and decent jobs. In this time of global challenge, even crisis, business as usual will not do. That is why I have made sustainable development my top priority. At Rio, we have an opportunity to set forth a far more encompassing vision for the future we want, and we have an opportunity to deliver on it. At Rio, we need to agree on a process to establish sustainable development goals that build on the Millennium Development Goals after 2015. Sustainable development goals that will lay the foundations for dynamic economic growth, respect for the planet, and social equity. We need a framework for more sustainable consumption and production, agreement to eradicate hunger, due momentum to ensure universal access to drinking water and preserve scarce resources, and the focused effort to improve life in the world's cities. We must also find better ways to measure progress that goes beyond gross domestic product. It is time to take a collective stand. It is time to recognize that human capital and natural capital are every bit as important as financial capital. It is time to invest in people. Rio Plus 20 is about people and their future. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say here and now that I am deeply concerned with the pace and ambition of the negotiations. But I am pleased that the Bureau for the Rio Plus 20 preparatory process has agreed on additional negotiating days. We have just over a month until Rio. We must use every moment. A successful outcome in Rio will reverberate throughout the world. It could set the stage for broad-based, equitable, and dynamic growth and development for a generation. Worldwide, more than 400 million new jobs will be needed over the next decade. That means that policymakers must get serious now about generating decent employment. We must also deal with the growing problem of inequality, which was rising even before the crisis. The hardest hit are women and young workers. Failure to address the jobs and inequality crisis will undermine social cohesion and create political instability. From the Arab awakening to the Occupy Wall Street movement, we have seen people taking to the streets in protest. Too often, gains towards prosperity and sustainable development are threatened by unstable markets and volatile energy and food prices. Looking ahead, 6 areas will be crucial in making a sustainable recovery from this crisis. First, global markets must work for all people, not just the elites. Second, we must tame volatile food and energy prices. Third, we must increase the resilience of countries to financial shocks. Fourth, we need more stable and better regulated financial sectors. Fifth, let us commit to greater financial inclusion. This means universal access at a reasonable cost to a wide range of financial products. Sixth, as countries struggle to get their fiscal houses in order, we must not imperil the vulnerable by cutting development aid. In focusing our budget deficits, let us not lose sight of the jobs deficit and investment deficit. These are the steps we need to take right now to recover from the ongoing economic and financial crisis. But we also need to take another step, a big step towards leaving the past behind and creating the future we want. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a month from now, more than 100 world leaders will gather in Rio. They will be joined by an estimated 70,000 leaders from business, NGOs, and social action groups. It is a truly historic opportunity, a unique moment when ordinary people and their leaders can come together in common cause and with a common will to make the decisions that will shape their common future. This is the moment for world leaders to rise above their differences, and moment to show political will and true global leadership. For clearly, we must unite around the shared vision for the future, a vision for equitable human development, a healthy planet, an enduring economic dynamism that will carry us far beyond the troubles of today. In short, we need to follow the roadmap toward sustainable development and the sustainable future. The choice is between the crisis of yesterday or the opportunities of tomorrow. This is once-in-a-generation moment. Let us seize it. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary General and Co-Chair of the High-Level Thematic Debate for his statement. As members are aware, this high-level thematic debate will comprise opening and closing segments, presentations by guest keynote speakers, a summit segment, a ministerial segment, as well as 4 roundtable discussions. Presentation by guest keynote speaker will start immediately after the opening segment, to be followed by a summit segment. After that, the ministerial segment will take place, as well as the presentation of the report on the 13th ministerial meeting of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We will now hear presentation by the guest keynote speaker, His Excellency José Manuel Barroso, President of the European Commission.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Heads of State and Government, Excellencies, distinguished ministers, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to speak here today in the United Nations among such distinguished speakers and before this audience. We in the European Union have been keeping a close and frank debate on these issues, both internally and with our international partners. Tomorrow I will be participating in the G8 meeting in Camp David, where the state of global economy will be central in our discussions, and next month I will be attending the G20 in Mexico, where the economy and the action plan for growth and jobs will feature prominently. However, no grouping or organization is so widely representative as the United Nations. And even if the bulk of the United Nations work is on matters of peace, human rights, and international security, we should not forget that the chapters 9 and 10 of the Charter concern international economic and social cooperation. This is precisely why I have gladly accepted the invitation from the United Nations Secretary General and of the President of the General Assembly to address all of you today, and I sincerely congratulate them for this timely initiative. The economic crisis has a global nature. Its impact has been global, and the remedies must also have a global dimension. Since its beginning back in 2008, the financial crisis has both highlighted and deepened weaknesses in national economic systems and also some very important global economic imbalances. In fact, if the irresponsible behavior of some in the financial sector, coupled by lax regulatory oversight, was the spark that ignited the problem, its massive spread and global scale impact was the result of deep-seated economic imbalances that built up before the crisis started and need to be corrected if we want growth to resume in a more solid and sound basis. In the years up to 2007, namely in the most developed economies, investors underpriced risk and misallocated capital on a massive scale, treating risky assets as if they were safe and inflating huge housing bubbles financed by reckless lending by both domestic and foreign banks. And when the bubble burst, a banking crisis ensued, and economies plunged into recession. In both the United States and Europe, the natural counterpart to a collapse in private sector spending was an increase in public sector borrowing, and high deficits since then have in turn pushed sovereign debts up dramatically. But while investors have so far been willing to finance at low rates large deficits in many major economies with high debts, they have taken fright in some cases at the ability of individual countries, for instance, individual Eurozone governments, to repay their debts, and in other cases at their ability to refinance them at reasonable rates. Suddenly, and I want to have this kind of quality, frank conversation with you, the European Union had to face a financial crisis which spread into an economic crisis, and at the same time, the European Union had to fix its internal economic and financial governance structures, especially in the euro area. But much has been done in these last 2 years to overcome the problems. In Europe, indeed, we are delivering a robust response to the crisis by repairing our banking system, strengthening our economic governance, setting up credible financial firewalls, and providing unprecedented solidarity to member states more exposed to the crisis. And of course, we are also promoting structural reforms for the medium-longer term, like the reforms for competitiveness, but also addressing the issue of internal imbalances, especially in the Eurozone. Our key concern, as in most parts of the world, is growth, naturally. But the question is, where does growth come from? And of course, the responses are not the same in different parts of the world. But at least in Europe, it is quite clear that for growth to come back to more important levels and to restore confidence, we need fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, and targeted investment. And indeed, at the heart of our response has been a twin-track approach of stability and growth. That means restoring sustainability to our public finances, because the crisis has shown that debt-fueled growth is unsustainable. And it means creating also the conditions for growth and jobs through structural reform and targeted investment. Firstly, there must be no let-up in our focus on stability. We need to stay the course without being blind to an evolving economic situation. Fortunately, the European rulebook allows for adaptability while remaining firmly focused on sustainability and ensuring sound public finances. Reducing debt and deficits is essential to build confidence and cut borrowing costs. Every euro spent on interest payments is an euro less for jobs and investment. In terms of firewalls, our permanent defense mechanism, the European Stability Mechanism, has alone a firepower of 500 billion euros, some $650 billion, based on paid-in capital of 80 billion euros, higher than any other international financial institution. Secondly, to regain competitiveness, there must be acceleration in structural reforms. There is work to do at both the national and European level. At the level of the European Union, we are working very actively to deepen the single market, the largest market in the world by value. Thirdly, to accompany stability measures and structural reforms, and since the key is, as I said earlier, growth, sustainable growth, we need to step up investment. We'll move forward with project bonds. This will attract funding of up to 4.6 billion euros a year over the next 2 years for key infrastructure projects in transport, energy, and in the digital area. We have also proposed boosting the paid-in capital of the European Investment Bank by at least 10 billion euros, which will make available in support of job creation. This could make possible around 180 billion euros in increased investment, which is equivalent to 1.5% of EU GDP. And we in the European Commission have also proposed a new budget for the next 7 years that shifts the focus of spending to growth-enhancing measures, focusing, of course, also in increased competitiveness. Given this list of actions, I believe that in spite of all the difficulties, and we are not complacent in the analysis of those challenges, we are on the right track. And I bring you a message of confidence. We are indeed doing a root and branch reform of our budgetary and economic policies. And beyond the so-called sound and fury, we are making good progress in laying firm foundations for economic recovery and sustainable growth. Of course, I have to tell you very openly that the European Commission would have preferred the response to be quicker and to be sometimes bolder. That is our role as the European Commission, a truly independent supranational body. But at the same time, and I'm sure that you'll understand, the European Union is a union of sovereign member states, 27 member states, 17 in the euro area. So of course we have to work on the basis of compromise, and of course we have to have the support of the 27 democracies in the European Union. But the important thing to understand in Europe's response, and that sometimes commentators underestimate, is that the euro is much more than a mere monetary construction. It is the product of a project of peace, which was at the origins of the European integration. And this political project is what unites us beyond momentary difficulties. And I want to tell you also, with the same independence we have from the member states, that I am fully confident in the commitment of the European member states, namely in the euro area, and also all the European institutions, including naturally the European Central Bank, to do whatever is necessary to overcome the current challenges. The lessons of the financial crisis must be absorbed by all of us, our institutions, our surveillance mechanisms, our defense, all need to be strengthened. The European Union is working towards this at all levels, and it is also important that others address the different challenges that they are facing in other parts of the world. In the G20, Europe will push for the implementation and enhanced monitoring of the Cannes Action Plan for Growth and Jobs. Tackling global macroeconomic imbalances and promote growth should remain at the core of the G20 agenda, but not growth driven by unsustainable borrowing. Growth must be socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. We must strive for solidarity, not just within, but across generations. In the context of G20, we have secured agreement on a substantial increase of the IMF's resources by over $430 billion, to which the European countries have contributed massively, more than half, indeed, $250 billion. This decision was important for all of us, not only in Europe, but all IMF members. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, the work inside the European Union has not distracted us from our broader world vision or led us to reduce our efforts to promote economic development, addressing more specifically the concerns with extreme poverty that still exist in many parts of the world. Let me give one clear example. Last month in Brussels, in the presence of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the European Commission launched its Energize Development Initiative. Our key objective is to help developing countries provide access to sustainable energy services to 500 million people by 2030. These and other challenges will be at the core of the Rio Plus 20 conference, and we are actively working towards its success. To this end, we are seeking to mobilize hundreds of millions of euros in additional funds to reach this ambitious objective, and if we work together and have the courage to implement change, it can be done. In fact, Europe is facing up to both its internal needs and its international obligations. We remain, as the European Union and together with our member states, the largest provider of overseas development assistance, with 53 billion euros per year, more than half of global aid for development. And through our everything but arms policy, we have the most open trading regime with the developing world, giving free access to the world's largest single market. Today, before you here at the United Nations, I'd like to affirm that this global commitment has not and will not be changed. Because the striking lesson from this crisis is that we are all interdependent. No country can sustainably prosper on the debris of its partners' economies. In today's world, no country is an island. That's why it is critically important to avoid any form of protectionism. This will be self-defeating, and I hope that all countries in the world respect the commitments taken in this regard. Indeed, in a world which is rapidly evolving, we need even more solidarity at global level, not just to deal with the current crisis, but to ensure that the opportunities offered in this age of globalization do not just benefit some countries or some sectors, but bring benefits to all of us. This is what we want for Europe, a more sustainable and inclusive economy, and this is also what we believe is important to achieve globally, sustainable and inclusive growth at the services of our citizens. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the President of the European Commission for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ali Babakan, Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by thanking His Excellency Nasir Abdulaziz Al Nasir, President of the General Assembly, and His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, for organizing this important high-level debate on the state of world economy and finance in 2012. The United Nations has a leadership role in promoting inclusive and equitable economic growth, sustainable development, and eradication of poverty and hunger. On the basis of its universal membership and legitimacy, the UN provides a key forum for discussing international economic issues and their impact on development. I believe that this event is timely in the run-up to the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which will take place next month in Rio. Our comprehensive deliberations today and tomorrow will shed light on the outcome of the Rio +20 conference. To refresh our memories, the report of the Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability, of which I had the honor to be a member, and UNDP 2011 Human Development Report had significant contribution to prepare a comprehensive vision for the Rio Summit. Distinguished participants, the global economy and financial crisis resulted in the collapse of large financial institutions, bailout of banks by national governments, downturn in stock markets, and a significant decline in economic activity. All these had adverse impacts on the development in many countries. Downside risks still persist. The recovery from the crisis is slow and equivocal in many senses. Short-term perspectives in addressing the problems are threatening the gains. Overspending and excess borrowing in comparison to the national savings in many countries are not sustainable and have created significant risks for future. The global crisis not only hit the country's growth figures, but also affected their labor markets and household income levels. Employment and income growth contracted, and unemployment increased in both developed and developing countries. It is estimated that 21 million jobs need to be created each and every year just to return to pre-crisis employment rates by the year of 2015. The crisis has also affected youth employment vastly. Youth unemployment rate exceeded 50%, even in some advanced economies. Crisis hit the progress on poverty reduction. It triggered social unrest, caused political instability, and pushed people out of the labor market. Poor people's access to health services and children's attendance to school deteriorated as well. These outcomes impede long-term development prospects and the achievement of the UN's Millennium Development Goals. The way out of the crisis requires a forward-looking, long-term set of policies and adequate action. It is imperative to send sufficiently strong signals to the markets for medium to long-term fiscal consolidation leading to debt sustainability. For those countries which have the space, there is a need to prevent premature withdrawal of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies in order to prevent repeating the same mistakes of the Great Depression. It is a big responsibility for the political leaders to find the right balance and justice between today's generation and future generations. It is very important to keep in mind that the activities of the central banks cannot substitute the necessary fiscal tightening or structural reforms in many countries. Governments should make the best use of the opportunity window provided by the central bank's liquidity operations and use this window to do the right things as soon as possible. Strengthening the financial sector should be another key objective. And I am sure that Paul Volcker, who is the next speaker, has a lot to say on this. Looking forward to hearing him. As a G20 country, we believe that better coherence and consistency of the international monetary, financial, and trade policies is instrumental to ensure openness, fairness, and inclusiveness with a view to building confidence in the world economy. Confidence is the key term here. No matter how much liquidity the central banks provide, no matter how much fiscal stimulus the governments try to put in, if there is no consumer confidence, if there is no producers' confidence, if the banks are hesitant to lend, then economic growth is not going to come. A more transparent and accountable international credit rating system should be structured so as to conduct sovereign risk assessments based on objective parameters. Protectionism ought to be prevented, not only in trade, but also in financial markets in order to increase investments, production, and eventually employment. Enhancing social equality and eradicating poverty should be central objectives of the international community. We should never ignore the long-term environmental consequences of today's policies. And our another next speaker, Joe Stiglitz, might touch upon how to measure in an effective way the efforts of the governments for sustainability and how to measure this in a quantifiable way. Ladies and gentlemen, many analyses point out that Eurozone is the epicenter of the crisis, and President Barroso's statements were highly welcome. In many of the European countries, fiscal consolidation is needed very urgently. Structural reforms are absolutely necessary to enhance competitiveness. While every country should continue to take the necessary steps, we would very much like to see stronger solidarity within the Eurozone. Distinguished participants, I would like to give you also a glimpse of what we have done in Turkey in terms of our macroeconomic policies, our development policies, and social consequences. Macroeconomic and political stability are the backbones of strong growth. Turkey had great strides in economic development, in particular over the last decade. We have managed a deep structural transformation process in our macroeconomic framework, public financial management and control, banking, healthcare, and social protection areas. With a human-centered approach, we have aimed to eliminate extreme poverty, enhance gender equality, protect environment, and improve education and health services for all. Indeed, Turkey has recorded good progress regarding these goals. Although Turkey has been going through high growth rates, this growth has been a relatively clean growth as well. Our carbon emission as Turkey has decreased by 20% already compared to the business as usual scenario. Thanks to the reforms that we have made timely, we entered the 2008-2009 period with strong public finances and a strong banking sector. I think this was one of the reasons why Turkey was differentiated from what has been going in many European countries. Also, in 2009, at the peak of the crisis, when many countries were announcing fiscal stimulus programs, we announced a 3-year medium-term program which was focused on fiscal consolidation. We wanted to make sure that debt sustainability in our country is never going to be perceived as a problem. This worked out very well for us. Confidence indices all went up. In 2010, our growth rate was 9.2%. In 2011, growth rate was 8.5%. It has been also a private sector-led growth. Not government spending, but private sector activity has been the key for high growth rates in Turkey. Since mid-2009, 3.7 million additional jobs were created in our country. Income distribution continued to improve. Statistically speaking, in Turkey, there is now no population earning less than $1 per day. Furthermore, the proportion of the population living under $2 a day decreased almost to zero. The ratio of population living under $4.3 a day, which was 30% in 2002, is now only 3.7%. With these results, Turkey has already met the MDG set for 2015. As for income distribution, we have made significant improvement, as it was pointed out in the OECD's recent report titled Divided We Stand. The report shows that income distribution has rapidly deteriorated in most of the OECD countries, except for only a few, and Turkey is among the few countries that was able to improve income distribution while increasing per capita income. Our good results for income distribution are due to three main policy areas. First, targeted social support programs. Two, a progressive tax regime which exempts families with 3 children for minimum wage. And also, third, but the most important point is letting the competition function in the country. This is very important. There are no more privileges, no more protected areas for any companies or any families. Every single Turkish company lives now in a very competitive environment, and that also helps to normalize our income distribution. Recently, we have observed some deterioration in our inflation figures and also in our external balances. With necessary measures, rebalancing in our economy already started. Distinguished participants, in the last decade, an important transformation took place in our healthcare sector. We started the Health Transformation Program, which provides effective, equitable, accessible, and high-quality healthcare service for all. In this context, the family medicine model and universal health insurance have been instrumental in improving access and quality of health services, especially for the most disadvantaged groups. Life expectancy at birth and life expectancy at age 65 are two major indicators to assess our performance, and both indicators show steady improvement since 1990. And particularly, there is a large, continuous, and linear improvement in life expectancy at birth between years 2003 and 2010. Reform process in the area of education plays a critical role in our development policy. Enhanced quality and relevance of education can serve as a mechanism for increasing potential growth and also our saving rates. We designed a conditional cash transfer program which supports poorest families with school-age kids, provided that kids are enrolled at school or vaccinated in the proper ages. This cash transfer program has been very effective in tackling poverty and improving the living standards for our next generation. We paid to the mother, not the father. We paid more for girls than for boys. We paid more for secondary education than for primary education. Distinguished participants, the most important element to reduce poverty on a sustainable basis is to create jobs. Reforming the labor market and improving the quality of labor skills are essential for job creation. Building blocks of this strategy can be summarized as making labor market more responsive to labor demands, enhancing labor skills through formal education, lifelong learning practices, and also active labor market policies to meet the needs of a modern industrialized economy. Small and medium-sized enterprises account for 80% of the employment in Turkey. Having this figure in mind, we give special emphasis to removing obstacles to SMEs development, expanding productive activities and job creation. We also gave utmost importance to raising the women participation in economic activities. Our efforts in this field include improving access to affordable childcare and gender equality in the workplace, increasing female entrepreneurship, lowering the cost of entry to the job market for the women. In 2010, we changed our constitution to have elements of positive discrimination for women in Turkey. We also put special emphasis on the employment of other vulnerable groups, especially the young population. For a young citizen in Turkey or for a woman of any age, if they enter to the job market for the very first time, Treasury is paying the Social Security premium for the employer, and this goes up to 4 years. Since 2009, as I said, out of the 3.7 million jobs that were created in Turkey, 1.5 million are women. Distinguished participants, the need for collective action to improve the global partnership for development remains as a crucial theme for all nations. Being among the fastest growing countries in the world, Turkey provides significant assistance to many countries. Despite being an emerging economy itself, Turkey has become a substantial contributor to development aid. Last year, our official development assistance posted a year-over-year rise of 38%, increasing to $1.3 billion. We are working also with the World Bank in the format of triangular cooperation. This is a new setup. For reform areas that we had good experiences, we share these experiences with other developing countries. We are also ready for similar programs with UN or UNDP. In 2008, we used to have 12 embassies in Africa. Now we have 27. Next year we will have 34. Turkish Airlines is now flying to 19 African destinations non-stop from Istanbul. We have already become a shareholder of the African Development Bank. Turkey is aware of the regional and global economic issues and stands ready to share its experiences on how to deal with crisis and post-crisis situations. Turkey will continue to promote the human dimension of economic growth and sustainable development. We attach paramount importance to the harmonization of the Istanbul Programme of Action for the least developed countries with the document for the Rio +20 conference. And I would like to thank you for your attention and patience.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Paul Volcker, former head of the United States Federal Reserve.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I do welcome this opportunity to be with you, however briefly, this morning. There can't be any doubt that the state of the world economy and finance deserves your attention and your government's attention, and my government's attention too. There's an interesting contrast. The first years of the 21st century climaxed more than a decade of strong world economic growth. There was really unprecedented progress, unanticipated progress in the so-called emerging nations. Literally hundreds of millions of people were lifted from poverty. Trade and finance became the handmaidens of progress. Almost all countries became part of and benefited from an increasingly integrated world economy. We now know that in the midst of the explosion in growth, we collectively lost sight of growing imbalances in both trade and finance. The sense of confidence in growth and the blossoming of complex financial mechanisms both tended to anesthetize us to concerns about the wide gaps in international payments among countries, the growing fiscal deficits within some particularly important countries. That simply could not last. It all ended up in a burst of speculative speculation and financial strain. The industrialized world sank into a deep recession as financial markets broke down. Recovery's been slow, unemployment is at unacceptable levels almost everywhere. The emerging world has escaped the worst of it, but there too, growth, performance, and prospects have scaled back. And now it's all further complicated by the apparent fragilities in Europe. Needed financial reforms still meet resistance. In many countries, including my own, the fiscal outlook is ever more threatening. Political divisiveness seems to be growing, and that divisiveness is not limited to the United States. You know all that. I do not need to emphasize that we are indeed in a dangerous situation. And the question is, what can the assembled nations of the UN, represented in this room, do about it? Legitimacy of universal membership is important. But the fact is, you have no executive authority. But even if you had, I suspect at this stage an absence of intellectual and political consensus right around the world would inhibit decisive steps. If that is the situation, that is something that you can help remedy in these few days of your roundtables and discussion today and tomorrow. Meanwhile, we do have international bodies directly charged with finding workable approaches. By their nature, their active managements are much more limited than this assembly, but they are potentially armed with instruments of persuasion and of authority. The IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, the new Group of 20 meeting at the highest level, the old G7. But it's also true that even those collective institutions have difficulty in reaching firm conclusions. Even more, they have particular difficulty in enforcing their conclusions on independent sovereign states represented in this room. There is, however, one large area in which a sense of common understanding and national commitment affecting everybody in this room is critically important. I am referring to the need to maintain open markets, particularly with respect to trade, but with respect to finance and intangibles as well. It was precisely the process of freeing trade and markets that drove the years of expansion. To retreat now, in response to internal economic and political pressure, could only undercut prospects for future growth and productivity. At the same time, I want to emphasize in this globalized world the need for certain consistency in regulatory approaches. That's most obviously true in the world of finance. The fact is, the actions of only a few nations, even economically small nations, can undercut reforms needed internationally. Bank capital requirements and accounting standards are two obvious points, but there are other restrictions on banks and markets that are relevant in requiring an international approach. The world of finance, as a consequence of technology as much as of policy, is truly international. Money moves with great fluidity. So can and do institutions. These days, no nation can close itself off. None of it wants to sustain and enhance progress. In terms of international reform, the old axiom at the creation of the United States seems relevant. If we don't hang together, we will surely hang separately. It is in this area that my insistence on the need for common discipline in maintaining open markets and in financial regulation and oversight are areas that every nation in this room shares responsibility. I trust that is one matter that will command your attention, your understanding, and your conclusions in your debate today and hereafter. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be with you this morning. Thank you.
I thank the former head of the United States Federal Reserve for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Joseph Stiglitz, professor at Columbia University.
Secretary General, Excellencies, the best that can be said for Europe and the United States is they look forward to a long malaise, slow growth, or stagnation. As Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister pointed out, GDP is not necessarily a good measure of economic performance or social progress. That was one of the main findings of the International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress that I chaired. But no matter how you measure economic performance, the way the global economy is performing today is not good. Nowhere is the suffering and the malperformance so clear as in the labor market, where, as the Secretary General pointed out, 200 million workers have lost their jobs. In the United States, a country which not long ago the unemployment rate was 4.2%, almost 1 out of 6 workers who would like a full-time job cannot get one now. In Europe, the unemployment rate is in excess of 10%. But even more disturbing is the fact that in several countries, 50% or more of the young people are unemployed. A period which should be a period of hope, of building up of human capital, has become just the opposite as skills deteriorate, weakening the potential for future economic growth. The social consequences are well known. Let me spend a minute discussing the global responses, and particularly the responses in Europe and the United States. This much should be clear. Austerity has not worked and will not work. No large economy has ever recovered from an economic slowdown, an economic downturn, let alone one of the magnitude that is facing Europe and America today, through a program of austerity. And Europe and America are both large economies. Structural reforms, as necessary and critical as they may be, will not pull Europe out of its downturn anytime soon. In fact, poorly designed, poorly timed structural reforms may actually exacerbate the problems. The problem is that today in Europe is a lack of demand, and these structural reforms are supply measures, not demand measures, and if poorly designed, they weaken total aggregate demand. Of course, it is true that firewalls are important, and Europe has done important work in constructing those firewalls, but they need to be higher. But no matter how high they're likely to be constructed, they won't work if kerosene is thrown on the fire that's inside the firewalls, and that's what's been going on recently. 2 weeks ago in Rome, I laid out an agenda of how to square the circle, how within a world of budget austerity one could promote growth. But unfortunately, the measures being taken so far, I believe, are inadequate. This much also should be clear. As great as the market failures were in creating the crisis, the bubbles that brought about the global financial crisis, today the markets are again failing. We have the same resources, the same human resources, the same physical resources, the same natural resources that we had in 2008 before the crisis. And having eliminated the distortions, we should actually have a higher GDP. But of course, instead, we have a much lower performance. It is clear that the markets are not utilizing our resources well. And it's also clear that our governments are failing to correct these failures of the market. We live in a world in which there are unused and underutilized resources and huge unmet needs. Recall that it's been half a decade since the breaking of the bubble, and the economies are not only not repaired, are not likely to be back to normal anytime soon. The prospects are bleak. In the United States, for instance, the forecasts of return to full employment by the end of the decade are looking increasingly dim. The prospects of recovering the growth that was lost are nil. The 1980s was spoken as the lost decade for Latin America, a lost decade that was a result of flawed economic policies. This decade will be the lost decade for Europe and America, and again, a lost decade as a result of flawed economic policies. 4 years ago, at the peak of the crisis, the President of the General Assembly of the UN brought together an expert group, which I was privileged to chair. The report of that group, which is available in this form and published in a large number of languages, was well received and I think helped influence the responses to the crisis at that time, but I think it did not have as much influence as I would have liked. Following on our report, there was a UN financial summit on June 26, 2009, and it culminated in the approval of an outcome document that represented the first step on a path. As the President of the General Assembly said at the time, we have an historic opportunity and a collective responsibility to bring new stability and sustainability to the international economic and financial order. The world economy would, I believe, be in a better place today if we had moved more resolutely in pursuing the recommendations of that meeting. I don't have time now to go through those recommendations. They should be accessible to all of you. Let me just very briefly speak to some of the objectives, some of the means, and the underlying philosophy. The underlying philosophy was a simple one and has been articulated here by several of the speakers. A global crisis needs a global response. We set forward a set of objectives of restoring confidence in economic growth and creating full and productive employment for all, safeguarding economic development and social gains, providing adequate support to developing countries, and ensuring debt sustainability. We did it through a variety of means, including making the stimulus work for all, containing the effects of crisis and improving the resilience, improving regulation and monitoring of the global financial system, and reforming the international financial and economic system and architecture. This morning, I want to highlight a few of the recommendations and highlight the unfinished agenda ahead. One of the things that we emphasized, not a surprise, was the importance of financial market regulation, and we laid out a comprehensive agenda, in many ways anticipating the work of the Vickers Commission in the UK and the Volcker Rule in the United States. One of the emphasis that we stressed was a need for better management of cross-border capital flows, again a view that's been echoed subsequently by the IMF. What is clear is that we have not gone far enough or fast enough in making the financial system stable and sound, let alone ensuring that the financial system returns to performing its critical roles in our economy, becoming the servant of our economy rather than its masters. We discussed two issues that have been seemingly shunted aside, like the need for sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. issues that have, in the subsequent years, become ever more paramount. We analyzed in depth, too, the need for reform of the global reserve system, which has contributed both to global inequities, global imbalances, a lack of global aggregate demand, and global instability. While in the months following our preliminary recommendations, the importance of this was recognized by member states across the world, discussions on this, too, have stalled. Our Commission highlighted the key role that the reforms in this area would have to play and provided a concrete set of agenda for the way forward. The Commission and the discussion of the summit that followed recognized the imperative that we attack the underlying problems. And again, regrettably, too little has been done. Previous speakers have talked about one set of underlying problems, the problems of global imbalances. But there's another one that I think this body should pay a great deal of attention to, and that is inequality both within and across countries, which our Commission identified as one of the underlying factors giving rise to the crisis. The IMF, in the meetings a little over a year ago, recognized the key role that inequality plays in economic and financial instability. My new book, to be published in the next couple of weeks, The Price of Inequality, shows that we are indeed paying a high price for our inequality, not only in terms of a divided society, but in terms of a global economy that is both less efficient and less stable. Finally, a key recommendation of the Commission was the need for a better way of addressing the world's economic problems. Globalization has meant that we are more integrated, more interdependent, and that in turn means the need for collective action at a global level for global cooperation. We need to go beyond the G20, which in the years since 2009 has failed to live up to the promise it seemed to show then. But even then, it was clear that there were fundamental problems, a lack of representation, a lack of political legitimacy. What is needed is to put the G192 at the center. The previous speakers have highlighted the importance, the central role that the UN can play. We proposed a way that could be done through a global economic coordinating council guided and informed by an expert group. That proposal was well received in the summit of 26 June 2009. I was hopeful then that the work would have begun then. What has happened since has been disappointing. The need for these reforms today is even clearer than it was some 3 years ago. The cost of delay is high, especially in our fragile global economy. I hope this meeting will provide the needed impetus to move forward on the agenda that was laid out in 2009. Thank you.
I thank Professor Stiglitz for his statement. We have heard the last guest keynote speaker. We will now begin the summit segment. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Donald Ramotora, President of the Republic of Guyana, who will speak on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Thank you, Mr. President, other heads of government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to be delivering my first statement in the General Assembly as President of Guyana. And on this occasion, on behalf of member states of the Caribbean community, I thank my CARICOM colleagues for bestowing this honor upon me and on my country. The persistent adverse state of the world economy remains a matter of global concern and demands that the United Nations address itself to the challenges arising therefrom. Invested with the hopes of the world's citizens and with the mandate of its charter, the UN has an obligation to ensure that global response to these challenges is inclusive, effective, and sustained. 3 years ago, leaders met in New York for the conference on the world financial and economic crisis and its impact on development. Today, the outworking of that crisis is still a work in progress. The danger of significant reversals is ever present. The IMF has pointed out that after 3 years of effort at stimulating recovery, the world economy is still fragile and the medium-term prospects are bleak. Indeed, talk of recovery can at best be described as premature. Even if there are some signs of renewed growth, this growth can hardly be regarded as deeply entrenched and is still extremely uneven. Several of the major contributors to the global output continue to place a drag on global growth and are themselves grappling with unsustainable fiscal balances, which hinder the ability to implement adequately the measures needed to stimulate a lasting recovery. The challenges in the Eurozone, faltering growth in the US economy, and a slowdown in growth in major emerging economies are indicative of the fundamental problems that still exist at the global level. Having met in 2009 to fashion an inclusive global response, tangible results continue to elude us. The inherent fragilities that facilitated the global financial and economic crisis have not been adequately addressed. Developing countries have borne and continue to bear a high cost for a crisis not of their own making, and the current state of the global economy suggests significance that can make a recurrence a continuing risk. The current debate can therefore only be a prelude to more deliberate and concerted action by the UN in follow-up to the undertakings of the 2009 conference. From the standpoint of the developing countries, this entails addressing the fundamental impacts of the crisis on their development prospects and on achievement of internationally agreed development goals, including the Millennium Development Goals. Progress towards the MDGs was already slow prior to the crisis, and will inevitably be further slowed as a result of the crisis and a combination of other concurrent challenges. Increased poverty and hunger has ensued. Over 1 billion people now face hunger on a daily basis, and poverty eradication gains have been eroded. The rise again in food prices, unless contained, could further aggravate the poverty challenge and have a devastating impact on poorer economies. Although more resilient than in earlier times, developing countries have borne the brunt of the present crisis, as reflected in the growth that is generally lower than the pre-crisis levels, already wrestling with harmful trading arrangements and the consequences of an inconclusive Doha development round. The circumstances of these countries have now been aggravated by the crisis. The adverse effects have included cuts to social programs, reductions in the flow of ODA and foreign direct investment, on international trade volumes and the level of indebtedness of developing countries, and a major loss of jobs. Some 200 million people, including more than 75 million young people, are reported to be out of work. All of these factors have had knock-on effects on the availability of domestic and international financing for development, not to mention multiple socio-economic implications. Mr. President, the CARICOM reality reflects a number of these pathologies: slow growth, high unemployment, particularly among youth, high levels of indebtedness, and limited policy space for transformative action, depressed tourism receipts, and external threats to legitimate engagement by some of our member states in the financial services sector. Middle income status, viewed through the prism of GDP per capita, has become an albatross, belying the real challenges faced by our countries and constraining access to much-needed resources. Crime and violence are the worst manifestations of the challenges faced in our societies. CARICOM economies have been significantly impacted, particularly in the services and financial sectors, given our heavy dependence on services and on trade with the tourism flows from North America and Europe. Contracting demand in those countries resulted in a significant reduction in tourism and in the prices for many of our exports. The situation, coupled with unfair regulatory action against the financial services sector, has caused major economic dislocation in a region with limited scope for diversification. Just as the Caribbean made no contribution to global financial crisis but faces major economic devastation as a result, in the same way, our countries face potential decimation by a climate crisis caused by others. Rio+20